Welcome. I'm Muriel Wasserman, the director of the Center for Jewish Ethics at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, and in a moment, I will have the pleasure of introducing today's lecturers. Those of you who have been with us during previous weeks know that this lecture series comes from a partnership between the Center for Jewish Ethics and the Katz Center for Advanced Judaic Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. We are grateful for a grant from the Campaign for Community from Penn's Office of the Provost and for support from the SNF Paideia program at Penn. I want to thank all the staff at the Katz Center for all of their work on this series. Later in this hour, you will meet Professor Steve Weitzman, director of the Katz Center, and Dr. Ann Albert, the Katz Center's director of public programs, who will participate in the Q&A session following the presentation. But a couple of quick announcements as we near the end of the semester. We have an addition to our schedule. We have added a concluding roundtable discussion that will immediately follow Shana Sippy's lecture in 2 weeks' time. During this roundtable, we will try to draw connections among the various lectures we have heard and also explore the practical implications of this scholarship. So Professor Sippy will stay on for the discussion with Steve and Ann and me, and we will also be joined by special guest, Dr. Ana Lucia Lopez Reveredo, whom you can read about on our website. I also want to remind you of a special opportunity next week when our lecturer is Dr. Clarice Harbone, who will be talking about Mizrahi Jews in Israel. Much of our focus this semester has been on the American Jewish community, and so this is our chance to engage with Israeli society. It will also be a unique opportunity to engage with an international scholar, as Dr. Harbone will be joining us from Morocco. A couple of logistical announcements. At the bottom of your screen, you can see there's a Q&A feature that you can use to share questions and comments throughout our time together. We will do our best to bring as many of these questions as we can to our lecturers at the end of the hour. Please also know that we have a closed captioning feature that is up to you to activate or to turn off if it comes on and you don't want it. For those of you who would like to further engage with today's topic following our hour together, we invite you to visit the website that accompanies this series, and we're putting a link in the chat. And we will be posting questions for reflection and discussion about today's presentation within the next day or so. Before we commence with today's learning, I do want to take a moment to acknowledge the solemnity of this day. On the Jewish calendar, today is Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day. The devastation of the Holocaust shadows every discussion of Jews and race, and sometimes during this lecture series, we have remembered this explicitly, and sometimes we have left the close relationships among racism, anti-Semitism, genocide, and destruction implicit yet unspoken. So today is the time for speaking those connections, and I want to step out of my scholarly role for a moment and invoke the Jewish tradition of honoring the memories of those who have died through dedications of our learning. May we dedicate our learning today to the sacred memory of the 6 million of blessed memory to whom Yom HaShoah is dedicated. And now, I want to welcome some remarkable teachers who are joining us. Our lecturers today are Helen Kim and Noah Leavitt. Helen is professor of sociology at Whitman College and currently serves as associate dean for academic affairs. Noah is a research associate of sociology at Whitman College and currently serves as the director of student engagement. Collaborators in life as well as in scholarship, they are the co-authors of Jew-Asian, Race, Religion, and Identity for America's Newest Jews. This is a remarkable book that joins rigorous research about mixed race families with personal experience. It is truly an honor to introduce them to you and to welcome them. Thanks for being here today.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Wasserman, for that lovely introduction, and also for the dedication to this very important day, Yom HaShoah. A special shout out to the Cat Center and Penn. We really appreciate and are honored by this invitation. And just a little backstory, when we were prepping for this webinar to take place, we got the chance to reminisce with Stephen and Anne, because Noah and I were actually supposed to have come out at the invitation of the Cat Center in 2018, in March 2018. And this talk was supposed to have taken place at the National Museum for American Jewish History. And there was a massive blizzard that hit in March 2018 that unfortunately resulted in the cancellation of our talk. And at the time, we were talking about whether or not we wanted to do something with video cameras and microphones and something virtual. And it just sounded so strange and awkward at the time. And now here we are 3 years later, and Zoom is just such a part of everybody's everyday reality. And so I'm actually very grateful that we get to join you in this way. So Noah and I are really excited to talk to everybody, predominantly about the work that we did that led to this book, Jew-Asian. And so I'd like to just take a couple of seconds to outline how our time is going to go today. We're first going to talk to you about what initially drew us to this project and to writing the book. We're also going to delve into what we did that resulted in this book. We're going to talk to you about what we found in terms of our conversations with couples as well as adult children. And then Noah and I thought that since the origins of this project were really a long time ago, we started thinking about this, oh gosh, I would say actually in 1997 when we first met, and then really we started thinking about it in 2007. So it's been almost 15 years. We thought that we could have a little reflective and forward-looking back and forth Q&A between the two of us, sort of a little chat where we pose each other some questions and sort of respond, looking back and looking forward in terms of how we're thinking about our work today. So with that, I will hand it over to Noah, who's going to talk a little bit about sort of the origins of the project.
Great, thanks. Thank you very much, everybody who is watching this afternoon, and thank you also to the Cat Center for hosting us in this kind of way. The ability to look back to a few years earlier and just look at the change that's happened is really extraordinarily powerful today. So Helen and I are kind of living in these two time moments at once as we're talking through some of our questions and some of what we found. This project, of course, a mix of personal and intellectual, trying to figure out some things about us and ourselves as individuals and our families, and also trying to think about the larger landscape of Jewish diversity in the United States and the Jewish community and communities as they continue to evolve. And so Helen had mentioned that we had started this project to some extent in 1997 when we met. We were both graduate students in the social sciences at the University of Chicago, and we met at a dinner party on a very cold, blizzardy February evening, and had a kind of interaction that for me was just the beginning of a beautiful relationship. And for Helen, it was kind of hopefully the end of the last interaction she would ever have with me. And just from very different starting points, we were, I think, confronted with the question of like, could I be with this person? What would it be like? I really felt like I was destined to live my whole life after that dinner party with Helen. And I think she was looking to try to get as far away from me as she possibly could. And as our relationship eventually started to take shape, so many questions percolated up about what would it mean to have a long-term commitment to each other with so many different components of our identities and our families and our upbringings and our heritages and our traditions. What would it be like to have that enormous variety of components all swirling around? And so to some extent, this project comes out of just trying to make sense of that. And then also the question about if that were to be our future and we were going to be successful as a couple together over the long term, bringing all of these components together, religion, no religion, different races, different parts of the country, different kinds of family stories, different immigration stories. What in the world would it be like if we ever wound up having children? And so to some extent, the passing down of all of those different components of our individual lives and then as a couple, wondering how that would play out. So those were some of the drivers for me that led to curiosity and really looking at how couples like us around the United States were negotiating and bringing all of these components of their families and their individual lives together. And I guess this is an interesting, unique connection for me, and I just want to raise it since we're participating in a Penn event today. My family had the good fortune of having two parents who are both Penn alumni, and both of my parents came from families who both were Jewish and both had very different ways of thinking about race and what it meant to be a Jewish person interacting with people with different racial and ethnic backgrounds, very, very divergent family stories. And so my life growing up was trying to make sense of, as a Jew, what did it mean for me to think about racism or racial justice or racial discrimination, and who was being discriminated against and why, and what was, as a Jewish person, what was my role in all of that? And so to some extent, this project gave me the chance to really look at my different kinds of family backgrounds about the belief and understandings of what race might be. And so lots of very personal benefits to exploring this project with Helen.
Yeah, as Noah was talking and relaying, mostly personally based interest in pursuing what would be a multi-year research project. I shared a lot of those personal questions in terms of our relationship and what it would mean to have a family and grow a family and be part of a community. But there also was the academic side of the larger landscape that we were in. For me, particularly as a young academic, where my area of expertise was actually not in anything Jewish studies related, had nothing to do with the sociology of American Jewry. But I was really, really curious because as Noah and I were living out our lives in the respective communities around the country where we were moving from, there was this narrative that the two of us started to feel, I think, on a much more personal basis, which was, I'm Jewish. I'm sorry, Noah is Jewish. I'm not Jewish. We were in an intermarriage. It's going to be impossible for you all to have a Jewish family, raise Jewish kids. Basically, it's going to be a disaster. And I thought on a personal level, I don't really believe that. I actually disagree with that. And I actually wonder what the academic literature has to say about this. So as I went and looked at the academic literature, there was obviously a lot that had been written on intermarriage, which painted a similar picture to what it is that Noah and I were experiencing on the ground, which was basically, and it sounds sort of trite right now, but intermarriage spells the doom of the Jewish people. Judaism and the Jewish people through intermarriage are going to disappear. And I really wanted to kind of see whether or not that narrative had been or could be challenged. So there was that aspect, but there was also this question of, does the body of literature with regards to intermarriage take into consideration not only differences in terms of faith within couples and families, but also differences in terms of race within couples and families? And this was incredibly important, not just for us as a couple, but in terms of the times that we were living in. So when Noah and I first met in 1997, that was 30 years after the Supreme Court case Loving v. Virginia, which struck down anti-miscegenation laws on a federal level that allowed for interracial marriage to take place. So we were living in a time where we were one generation post Loving v. Virginia, and starting to see, you know, in our midst, in society, in the New York Times styles and wedding section pages, more interracial marriages. So that was a really interesting curiosity for us, I think, starting at the beginning of our relationship. And in terms of the larger body of literature on intermarriage from a Jewish lens, my read of it, our read of it, was there was really not much, if anything, that was being said about racial differences in marriages as well as within the family context. So Noah and I, we did a little bit of digging, and the digging really started in 2007, where we contacted a number of sort of big name institutions to see, you know, are your demographic repositories where you're collecting information about contemporary American Jewish life and American Jews, are you taking into consideration race? And we asked a number of institutions, including, we actually went and we had a meeting at the Union of Reformed Judaism's headquarters in New York. And we went to the URJ and said, you know, we're just really curious, does the URJ or synagogues within your midst keep information, demographic information that looks at racial difference? And we had a conversation with a senior member, and I'll never forget this. The senior member sort of took a pause when we asked the question and said, that's really interesting. That's really interesting. We don't collect that information. We don't really look at race. And he said, because if we were to take into consideration race, we would have to acknowledge that racism within the American Jewish community exists. That was just mind-blowing for us. And we'll talk a little bit more about sort of the current day reflections on that conversation at the end. So we kept on digging, and as we were asking all of these institutes and universities, everybody said no, but go and talk to Gary Tobin. And Gary Tobin was a very famous demographer who actually was the head of the Brandeis Cohen Center for a while. And he left academia to move out to the Bay Area, where he started his own think tank and an organization called B'Cholashon with his wife, Diane, which was created to basically understand the racial and the ethnic diversity of Jews, not only in the United States, but worldwide. So Noah and I ended up striking a conversation with Gary and his wife, Diane. And that institute, B'Cholashon, actually was in the process of collecting demographic information that looked at racial and ethnic variation, particularly with regards to Jews in the United States. So through that relationship with Gary and Diane, we were able to kind of plant the seeds of this project that Noah is going to go into a little bit about in terms of what we actually did.
Okay, so Gary was, and Diane is, an incredibly action-oriented individual, and they're a very action-oriented couple. And they basically said, go for it. We will help you try to find Jewish Asian households across the United States, either in our network, people we know, or people we might be able to get to, families who might have been in touch with us somehow, or Bechol Lashon had so many great network access points into lots of different sectors of the American Jewish community. And they said, if you can figure out a way to ask questions that you think will help illuminate what does it mean to be in a relationship like this, we will enable you in whatever way and with whatever resources we can. So we took them up on that. And we decided to, since we had no idea what the potential landscape would be in terms of what an interview pool would be like, we decided to create a kind of volunteer survey where if somebody was in a relationship that they thought about as combining Jewish and Asian somehow, they could signal their interest in, letting some researchers ask them about it for a couple hours. And so during 2008 and 2009, Bechol Lashon helped us distribute a survey around the United States through many, many different kinds of avenues, both within mainstream Judaism and then also through lots of different sort of areas of innovation and creativity in the American Jewish community. And so we let that sit out for about a year. And at some point we said, well, we should see what's in here. And we opened the survey, and there were about 250 some responses from people who were inside what they thought of as Jewish Asian households or Jewish Asian couples or Jewish Asian relationships. And they said, here we would love to kind of tell you about what it's like being who we are. We'd love to participate in your project however we can. So we wanted, in our effort to try to really get a sense of the variety, how diverse is the American Asian Jewish community, we really looked at these 250 potential volunteers, and from them tried to select the widest range of kinds of Jewish Asian households. So, mixed on, what level of religiosity, was there a religious affiliation or independent Judaism? Did people think about themselves as religious Jews or cultural Jews? People who identified as Asian or Asian American, what was their background, what countries, what religion? We looked at sort of variety of age, variety of parts of the United States, tried to get a mix of same-sex or heterosexual couples, as many different kinds of Jewish Asian households as we could. And we wound up selecting 34 of these individuals to ask them questions with their partner about their lives and their families, the relationship. And we've concentrated on 4 areas in the United States with high concentrations of both Jews and Asian Americans. So Southern California, the LA, Orange County area, Northern California around the Bay, the New York City, and then also here in Philadelphia. Those were our 4 kind of parts of the map that we really spent a lot of time in. And so spent about a year and a half interviewing these 34 couples, and wound up kind of thinking through what we were seeing, and we were able to come out with some really interesting understandings about how these households were thinking about so many aspects of their identity. And then we wound up writing it up in Contemporary Jewry, and I kind of published it, and got a lot of attention. There had not really been any research on Jewish Asian couples, although it seems like it's such a kind of running cultural joke to some extent, and also just a kind of popular cultural practice, as Helen was saying with the New York Times. So we published that, and then the response was, well, that's great with these couples, but what about the kids? What about, young people in these households? So then we went back to Gary and Diane and Tobin, and they said, Bechol Lashon will help you if you need help. So try to see what it's like with the young people from these households. And so that's what we did. We then designed a project to try to talk with young people, meaning ages 18 to about 25 or 26, in those same 4 parts of the United States, who grew up in households that they described as Asian Jewish. So they were the offspring of the kinds of couples we met. And during 2011 and then later in 2014, we talked to 39 individuals who described themselves as kids of Asian Jewish households. And we were able to kind of hear their stories and hear their experiences and hear the different ways that they made sense of their very rich and robust identities from both of their parents. And we wound up writing about that. And so we had the chance to both look at the couples and then also young people who were from households that were like the ones that we met for our couples, but we didn't interview any of the kids of the couples we met. So there was no connection between the two interview groups. There was one set of the couples and then one set of kids, and they were in the same places, but there was no connection between them. So we were able to do this multi-generational assessment. So I think that's enough of a description about our investigation here.
You want to talk? Yeah.
Well,
So yeah, that I would
Okay.
say I have nothing to add there. And I think Noah is going to talk a little bit about what we found in terms of our discussions with couples. And then I will talk about our findings pertaining to the adult children of similar kinds of intermarriages.
Okay, great. So let's share a couple of things with the couples that we learned. So first of all, one of the strongest threads of connection among the vast majority of the couples was a feeling of a shared alignment of values between Judaism and the Asian heritage that they were bringing into the relationship. So over and over, people talked about some of these characteristics that they saw as being almost overlapping, whether it was quest for high level of education or a commitment to elders and senior members of their families or their communities, intensive work ethic and striving for excellence and being persistent when challenged by professional and obstacles that may be getting in the way of them achieving a certain kind of goal. So people in these couples talked about their backgrounds as essentially not necessarily overlapping, but being very, very similar to the point where they felt a kinship with their partner because the values were similar, no matter where they were coming from. And so over and over, people represented that as a real strength of their household, which is that they really often saw the world in very similar ways, even though to some extent they presented to the world in such different ways, racially or in how they carried themselves or how they maybe carried aspects of their backgrounds. They saw what each of the other person in their household was about was something very similar, almost identical to themselves. So that was really interesting. We hadn't really expected that that's how people were going to talk about themselves, but it came through large percentage of the couples. One of the next findings was and this was surprising to us too, from what some of what Helen was citing in terms of research showing some of the risks of intermarriage, was an incredibly strong partnership commitment to Judaism through Jewish practice, and also carrying Jewish identity from their relationship out to the world. And so almost all of the couples we talked to would go through these lists of different ways that Judaism was a part of their daily or their weekly or their annual existence and household practice, and way that they were committing resources and time and energy to creating Judaism within them, where only a few of the couples were actually two Jewish couple households. So there were some couples we talked to who both of the members of the relationship were Jewish and identified as Jewish, and one also was Asian or Asian American. And so that's important to point out. So some of the couples were identified both as Jewish, and some couples identified as one person. That was the majority. But regardless, nearly all of the households were creating Judaism and Jewish practice in a regular way, with enthusiasm, with good energy, and with good feeling. And we're looking for ways to participate in the Jewish community. To Helen's point about the comment that we heard at the URJ early on is that we did hear from a number of the couples that sometimes they experienced feelings of exclusion or othering or outsiderness when they would go into a Jewish space, and that led them to make some other decisions about maybe where they wanted to have a Jewish home if they were thinking about a synagogue or a JCC or some other kind of Jewish communal organization. And sometimes they would keep looking around, or sometimes they would just bring their practice inside their home. But it was interesting to us that those obstacles never really seemed like they diminished the couple's interest in their own Jewish development and practice. And then I want to say that the last point that also kind of surprised us, but maybe as you're hearing what was coming through these interviews wound up being very strong, was that often the non-Jewish member of the household, sometimes who was Asian or Asian American, sometimes who was not, was actively involved in the production of Jewish practice and acquisition of Jewish knowledge or participating in Jewish events. And it wasn't a situation where it was primarily one of the members, often the Jewish one. It was really both members of the household. And so really caught us off guard, because I think we had been seeing some of the literature where, one member of an intermarriage was the chief driver of the Jewish practice of the household. But what we learned from the couples we met was that that was actually not the case. It was really often a shared project or a very combined partnership between both of the people. So those were some of the areas of the couples that really got our attention and were quite intriguing.
I mean, I think one of the things I want to underscore before I talk about the kids, and also in relationship to what I'm going to tell you about some of the findings with the kids, is that we were really surprised, in part because we knew the literature, but also I think just generally surprised at how much consistent Jewish, I would say religious practice there was in the home. So it was not just about, to use a phrase that we may hear, it's not just lox and bagels Jews. These were families that were doing Shabbat consistently. They were going to synagogue consistently. They had table rituals consistently. So consistent, sometimes daily, definitely weekly practice that was religiously grounded. That was really, I think, I don't know if it was surprising to you, but it was something that we were not expecting with the kind of strength and frequency that we did see. And certainly, I would say, disagreed with the literature that was talking about the sort of the disappearance of religious and cultural practice through intermarriage. So as Noah was saying, we ended up talking to 39 adult kids of intermarriages that were similar to the couples that we interviewed. So just to clarify again, we did not talk to the kids of the couples that we interviewed. We talked to kids of similar kinds of intermarriages. And we talked to them about a whole variety of things related to identity. So not just Jewish or Asian identity, but also racial identity, political persuasions, things about their lives other than just being Jewish or Asian. And so I just want to reinforce a few kind of major points, things that we found. The first is, and I would say that this is consistent for those who argue that race is the epiphenomenal, it's the primary master category in the United States. The adult kids really first and foremost thought of themselves as either multiracial or mixed race in terms of their identity. And the way that they described themselves would be using things like, well, I'm mixed, I'm white/Asian, I'm half Asian, I'm half Jewish. There's a variety of ways in which they sort of signaled and talked about being mixed. And being mixed was very much a core part of who it is that they were. And as we sort of probed a little bit about the significance of the identity, being mixed to them came with a sense of feeling unique or special in sort of a positive way. But our respondents also talked about how being mixed or multiracial meant that you were constantly navigating so many different kinds of social spaces where you never really felt like you really fit in or belonged. So there was a sense of, uniqueness or specialness, but on the other side, I would say the pain and discomfort of navigating social spaces in which folks didn't really ever feel like they truly belonged. That was one, I think, really important finding. We were really interested, as I think a lot of people were saying, well, what about the kids? What about the kids? What's going to happen with the kids? The kids definitely had a very strong sense of Jewish identity. Being Jewish for them was definitely about identifying with a lot of things, including being part of a people, being part of a culture, spiritual identification, and a lot of the adult children we talked about actually affirmed what it is that we were seeing with the couples that we talked about in terms of coming from households where there was a strong and consistent sense of religious practice on an ongoing basis throughout their childhood and adolescence. So these were the sort of multiple ways in which the kids of intermarriages talked about and really felt that they were Jewish, and they were very strong in their Jewish identity. I would say that for the most part, in terms of their sense of Asian identity, if there's a spectrum in terms of strength and weakness, I would say that they were less strong in their sense of Asian identity. And to use a term that the sociologist Herbert Gans used to talk about ethnicity, their sense of ethnicity was really more symbolic. It was a type of a symbolic ethnicity. There was a lot of connection to things like a food, celebration of holidays or festivals, but not the same kind of strength of identity in terms of the cultural and the peoplehood connections that they identified as being part of who they are as Jews. So, I mean, I think the picture that you're trying to paint is that these were folks who are pretty strong in their varieties of identities. And while on the surface that is a great thing and it seemed very positive, I think Noah and I also want to underscore that there were also a lot of examples of very painful experiences that adult children talk to us about, particularly with regards to being constantly questioned for being Jewish, even though their sense of identity internally was very strong. And these kinds of questionings, I would say, there's a spectrum of experiencing microaggressions to macroaggressions, existed in Jewish and non-Jewish spaces alike. And so I just want to read you an example from our book to kind of perhaps illustrate and personalize a story. So we talked to one female interview who described a very typical encounter with people that she doesn't know, where they try to decipher who it is that she is. They tried to code her. And she says, a lot of people think I'm Mexican when they first meet me. Most people just assume that I'm not Jewish, and they can tell right off the bat that I'm somewhat Asian or something ethnic. So they're always shocked when they find out that I'm Jewish, which to me feels really weird because I feel so much stronger about my Jewish identity than my Asian identity. So that's always kind of a weird balance. I think that quote sort of illustrates the sort of internal sense of identity as there's this interplay with external forces. And just sort of to kind of extend off of that, Noah and I were very curious, well, how is it that you respond to those kinds of funny, you don't look Jewish. How is it possible that you can be Jewish? No way that you're Jewish. How do you respond? And I would say that when we talk to these individuals, I was always reminded of Rabbi Angela Buchdahl-Warnick's very famous piece, Kimchi on the Seder Plate, where she talks about having been in Israel as a person who was very firm and strong in her sense of identity as a Jew and her commitment to the Jewish people, being constantly questioned for who it is that she was in Israel because of what she looked like, and wanting to basically abandon, give it up, give up being Jewish. And the reason that I'm bringing her up is because when we talked to these adult kids, they said the exact opposite. These were opportunities for them to actually more actively and strongly assert to others who they were as Jews. So that was just an interesting sort of a juxtaposition for us, kind of reflecting in terms of those kinds of changes, I would say over time, with regards to how it is that these young people we talked to were responding to challenges to their identity.
We could probably switch.
So we're gonna stop here. And this is perhaps a good inflection point for us to hand it over.
Okay, well, thank you both so much. We're going to be joined in a moment. There she is, Dr. Ann Albert will be joining us. We have a lot of questions in the queue, but I thought while Ann runs through them that I would ask an opening question. And I really want to thank you both so much. And it's also interesting to see how you collaborate as as partners in a marriage, and how you balance your personal experiences with your scholarly work. That's also fascinating, but maybe a topic for a different conversation. So one question I have is about the term Asian, which is like the term Hispanic or Latino. This came up a few talks ago. It's a term, it's an umbrella term that Americans use to kind of bunch together people from very different cultural backgrounds, people with very different historical experiences, different immigration stories, with all the anti-Asian violence that's happening in the United States right now. Want to realize is what a broad spectrum of people that affects. It's, Chinese, Japanese, Filipino, Malaysian, South Asian, and so on and so forth. And I'm wondering if those differences factored into your research, if you found that there were differences between, the experiences of, Koreans or Chinese, or if that was part of your research, and if so, like how does it inflect things?
Do you want to lead with that?
I can get going. Sure. I'll start. We did try to interview couples to look for a variety of different ways that people identified as having Asian heritage. And so I think we had probably 8 or 9 Asian backgrounds represented among the couples that we spoke with. We were interested in this. Obviously, the religious variety among Asian countries is significant, and we tried to also bring that out. We talked to a couple couples where there was Christianity as part of the Asian member of the couple's background, but that didn't really seem to make much of a difference. And so we didn't find too much variety in terms of the kinds of responses that we learned from those interviews based on people's background. It was really very similar no matter where they were coming from or where their families' backgrounds were.
Yeah, I would say, and Stephen, correct me if I'm wrong, I actually interpreted the question differently, so I'm going to give a different answer from Noah. I would say I agree with his categorization of the sample. And what I heard Noah say was it didn't really make it very much of a difference in terms of how it is that Judaism or Jewish identity played out with regards to their household. So everybody, for the most part, people were on board in terms of having and growing Jewish homes. I would say in terms of the Asian identity, kind of looking at the variety of ethnicities represented, I would say that there was a variation within and amongst ethnicities regarding the strength of the Asian identity. So how strongly one identifies as being Asian, I would say did vary. I think some of that perhaps has to do with proximity to family members and or a particular Asian ethnic community in terms of where one lived. I would say some of that has to do with generational status and what it is, what one grew up with in terms of either language, cultural reinforcement in one's family of origin. So I would say that there was a variety within and amongst those who identified as racially or ethnically as Asian, some of which were Jewish, with regards to how it is that they thought about and experienced their Asian identity. The one thing that I will say, though, and I think this is very timely, is the experience of constantly being questioned as belonging in the United States and being a legitimate member of the United States. The experience of being a forever foreigner, regardless of whether or not you're a third generation Korean American or a first generation Hindu Indian, was consistent. And I think that is central to the Asian American experience, recognizing that that umbrella term encompasses 50 some odd countries.
Thank you. I'll turn things over to Anne now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I have so many, I want to ask you lots of follow-up questions about that, but I also want to be true to what the people have been asking in the Q&A. So I'll try to stick to them for the moment. A lot of people are asking questions about gender dynamics and even what one person phrased as sexual politics between the partners in the household. So did it make a difference overall whether a non-Jewish partner was Asian or not? Which partner identified as Asian or partners identified as Jewish? And why? So obviously people are suggesting that maybe there's a sense that Jewish women would be more likely to perpetuate practices and Jewish practice in the household. There are, potentially other forms of gender dynamics at play there. Can you speak about that a little bit?
Sure, I can start.
Okay.
That's a great question. And I want to recognize, especially in this time where there's a lot of attention on Asian women's bodies as sites of fetishization and dehumanization. That has been a consistent thread throughout the Asian American experience, going way, way, way back. So I say that to say Noah and I were cognizant and wanted to think about how that mattered for our research design and for our discussions. And one of the things that was surprising in terms of the sampling survey that we sent out through Behola Shown is we really expected to get much more of a skew in terms of respondents along this line, like white Ashken normative looking white guy, nice Jewish boy from Ithaca, New York, second generation Korean American surfer girl from California. Okay, we expected a lot more respondents to skew that way. When we look at the heterosexual couples who responded, it was really evenly split. So just reverse it. We got pretty much a 50-50 split in terms of not only this type of pairing, but Asian American male who is not Jewish, paired with white female who is Jewish. So our sample, in terms of the couples that we talked to, we tried to maintain that 50-50 split. Having said that, women do the work. Women are the ones who, yes, they can get the buy-in from their male spouses, and I'm predominantly talking about heterosexual couples here. They can get the buy-in from the males, but women, regardless of whether or not they were Jewish or not, racially Asian or not, they were the ones that were doing the heavy lifting. With the support of their spouses, they were the ones, making sure that there's, challah, candles, and wine on the table, regardless of whether or not they were Jewish or not. They were the ones schlepping the kids to Sunday school. They were doing all the schlepping. They were the ones that were doing the heavy lifting. And I think that is consistent with what we know about gender divisions of labor in terms of the creation of the home and the domestic sphere. There's a phrase from a famous historian, women are the keepers of the culture. And I would say women in our sample, Jewish and non-Jewish, were the keepers of the culture.
That's fascinating because it aligns with what is different from the idea within Judaism that it's women who pass things on. So following up a little bit on thinking about the sample, we had a few questions of people asking about what about people who are not really Jewishly involved? What about people who, Jews who feel alienated from Judaism in general, who don't observe Judaism in the home or affiliate themselves with Jewish groups and their forms of intermarriage. So it seems like your sample was maybe self-selecting for people for whom that wasn't the case. So is it possible to speak at all about the differing experiences of people who are maybe what we say culturally Jewish or ethnically Jewish, but who aren't involved?
Sure, I can get going with that. Sure. Absolutely. I mean, people did volunteer to participate in a research project looking at Asian and Jewish identities. And so there are just some limitations that we try to be humble about in that situation. Having said that, a number of people did volunteer who identified from the very beginning as cultural Jews, and we decided to interview them to try to figure this out. And then we sat down with them, and they were people who had strong Jewish identities with no communal involvement, no religious practice, living in New York, having the bagels, and they were as Jewish in the way that they described themselves and their household as somebody who was, a frequent synagogue visitor and JCC board president, and every single holiday was a huge production in their household. The dynamics in those households didn't come through particularly differently in terms of the commitment to having kids who identified as Jews in whatever way was possible. And what wound up happening, because I think all of the, at least as I'm remembering our couples, the Jewish members of couples who identified as culturally Jewish brought Jewish religion and practice to be available to their kids, but they just didn't do it themselves. And so there was that kind of split among the parents and the kids in terms of what they felt like was appropriate and what was responsible and what they wanted. It was just for the next generation, let's make sure that the kids have that. So in those ways, those households kind of behaved similar to where the parent or parents who identified as Jewish were quite strong and active and had the long list of things that they did every year. And my, just sort of thinking back through these interviews, everybody was very proud about their Jewish identity when they identified as cultural and non-religious Jews. And that didn't seem to be sort of an obstacle to them feeling like they were, embodying their tradition and their family and their heritage and, living up to expectations of their parents or their grandparents, that they were very comfortable in that, and that they did feel in lots of ways Jewish to a great extent, just not without lots of ways that other people were kind of spending time and energy and using resources to bring their Judaism to the forefront. So yeah, anyway, that's a good point, because I think we were wondering whether those individuals would have very sort of minimal Jewish feeling and practice identity in the household, and they really didn't, at least the ones we met. So if we went back and tried to find more individuals like that in couples like this, but maybe, you know, there aren't very many individuals who identify that way in couples like this that are really out there. So that was one of the things that we were left with those kinds of families.
Can I add a little something? And as Noah was talking, I was remembering a number of examples of this is an important question, and I really feel, and I feel like we saw and heard that for those partners who were culturally Jewish, who said, you know, I really don't want to have anything to do with religious community. I don't want to go to synagogue. I'm not a synagogue Jew. I'm not stepping foot in a synagogue. But I want my kids to have a strong sense of Jewish identity. It was often the spouse who would say, well, if this is what you want, you kind of have to participate in these forms of communal Jewish life. Like, you don't really get a pass. So like, you can think of yourself all you want, but really, if we're going to be raising Jewish kids and having a Jewish home, and this is important to you, you kind of got to do it a different way. So it was often the spouse who would bring along, you know, the spouse who didn't want, or who didn't grow up or didn't want to, or was resistant to participating in more religious and more formal ways of communal engagement, to say, you got to do this. You got to do this, especially if we're going to be doing this as a family, and this is important for your kids. And I'll support you 100% of the way and drag you along at the same time.
So because we only have a few minutes left, I want to tell you a question, but not ask you to answer it. There's something really special. There's somebody attending now who says that she was interviewed by you two. And yeah, and she says, as she's listening, she is curious about kids are so central, obviously, to these dynamics as you've described them. But then she wonders if you talk to any couples who later, once they're empty nesters, after the children are out of the house, or after the questions of how to raise children stop being central, how that changes for the couple. Now, the reason why I don't want to ask you to answer it is because with our very short time, I do also want to make sure that we get to experiences of Asian Americans within the family and within the Jewish community. So there are a lot of questions from the audience about whether the Asian partners that you spoke to felt that they had experienced racism within the Jewish community, and the ways in which and for children, their mixed status or their relationship to the Jewish community, whether that felt like a mitigating factor or a complicating factor. I just want to sort of go there a little bit before we close.
Yeah, I would.
If we do have an hour.
Yeah.
I know.
How special to have a former, I'm sorry, an interviewee present in the audience. So hi, and I wish we could have extended our project. I think we would have made it a longitudinal project to see, like, how do all of these identities sort of shift and change. Let's talk about the Asian American stuff with the limited amount of time. Do you want to?
Well, I mean, the answer is yes. In the couples, the Asian or Asian American member of the couple, whether or not they were Jewish, we almost always heard several or more stories about acts that seemed racist or had kind of a discriminatory underpinning, or were overtly racist or discriminatory in Jewish settings, often in synagogues, but also in other places. And so that was 100% consistent across all of the couples. The kids, just to kind of sort of very quickly, experience almost the same thing, but had such a different kind of reaction, where, as Helen was kind of starting to allude to earlier, they often leaned into the chance to really confront somebody and use the opportunity to expand somebody's sense of the Jewish community when they got a comment or a look or something that seemed like there was this othering or this kind of you're in the wrong place. Very different than the parents who often just left that setting, left the synagogue, left the organization, left the JCC, left the community group, whatever it may have been. There was an exit. The kids, more often than not, stayed and said, hey, I have a great sense of my Judaism. I like being Jewish. I feel pretty good about what I know, what I do, who I hang out with, what I'm committed to. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about that, because you're operating in a very limited sphere of what the Jewish people in the United States is in the 21st century. And so that was really great. And I mean, I guess it's almost end of time. We have 2 kids, and we can totally see this in them, where they are very strong in their sense of Judaism. Their ages 12 and 9, and they take on people who ask them the kinds of questions that seem like they're skeptical, or that they're conveying are you really, do you know what you're talking about? And our kids like to work on them. And so it was neat seeing these, late teens, early 20-year-olds who love their Judaism, and we're kind of sad that other people were missing out on the chance to have them be a part of their Jewish community by treating them in ways that were making assumptions about them that were completely inaccurate and unfair. So I know we're 11:31, but it's a great question. And we love that the generational split was so significantly different in very strong ways.
That is really hopeful. And you have to think that it will come back and benefit the Jewish community to be being expanded in that way. That's amazing.
Well, and we love that, we got an email from the URJ this morning that said that they're kicking off a major racial justice initiative. And so it's just so unbelievable today to be, thinking about the story that Helen told about our interaction with the URJ and just kind of how off they seemed. And now here we are, that organization and all of the energy and resources and power they have is doing the things that, the kids that we interview wish that organization, would have done. And they're, really glad that they're doing it now. So it's really shifting just in a few years. And it's great to see. And I think part of it is, to your point, the young people are saying this isn't good enough. We know who we are and you need to get with it, or you're missing the chance to have the next generation of active, strong, positive, optimistic Jews, kind of make things happen. And that's sad when that becomes unavailable because there are these very limited views about who the Jewish people includes.
Yeah.
So I just want to weigh in here because we're out of time, but I think that is a great kind of hopeful, encouraging note for the future. It's been wonderful to have this chance to learn from you both, and we're very grateful to you for sharing some of your insights, and thank you for being part of the series. Thank you both. So if you're in the audience, we want to welcome you back next week. And in the meantime, I wish everybody well. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.